mail-in voting is a terrible thing.
If you ever agreed to it, you'd never have a Republican elected in this country again.
We are witnessing a tidal wave of voter suppression around the country.
If you look at Alabama,
Arkansas,
North Carolina, and Georgia, which is becoming ground zero.
Georgia's tight race for governor is getting national attention.
Brian Kemp is not only the Republican gubernatorial nominee, he's Georgia's Secretary of State.
Stacey Abrams looking to make history by becoming the nation's first female African-American governor.
The Democrats are working hard, registering all these minority voters.
Civil rights leaders say Kemp is illegally removing people from Georgia's voters list.
The purges, they've been going on for over a century in this state.
My girl wanted to vote, and they were trying to keep her from voting.
The lines was crazy everywhere.
I tried contacting the Georgia Elections Board. My vote will not be counted.
I'm 65, and for the first time, I did not get a chance to vote.
We are not going to let them take from us what our grandparents and parents fought to give us in the first place.
The coronavirus pandemic is creating concerns ahead of the 2020 election.
We are here to resist an ID law that is undemocratic.
On my mother's dying bed at 92 years old, former sharecropper, her last words were, "Do not let them take our votes away from us."
Good morning on this Thursday, January 13th, 2022, and welcome to another edition of the National Newspaper Publishers Association's Let It Be Known. President Biden will meet with Senate Democrats today and push for his party's change to the filibuster and pass voting rights legislation. The president will attend a closed-door Democratic caucus lunch to discuss the push to pass voting rights and potential changes to Senate rules. The meeting comes as Biden is stepping up his public push to get voting rights legislation through the Senate in the face of Republican opposition, as progressive groups have urged him to lean into the fight to win over members of his own party on changing the rules after Democrats missed self-imposed deadlines last year. We discussed this morning. We expected to be joined by New York Democratic Congressman Jamaal Bowman, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law Voting Rights Project co-director Marcia Johnson Blanco, Capitol Hill journalist extraordinaire Lauren Burke, also NNPA correspondent Barrington Salmon, and Let It Be Known correspondent James Wright of the Washington Informer. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning.
Great to have you. Listen, I am going to throw this question out there. Hopefully the congressman will join us shortly. It's a question that I've asked before, but I want to throw out to this panel. 1965, James, we talked about this before. And amid tumultuous times, the civil rights era, voting rights was passed, civil rights was passed. Why in 2022 this legislation, voting rights, is having a hard time and hasn't been passed?
Well, let me just say that the problem with 2022 started in 1980 when Ronald Wilson Reagan was elected president of the United States. And as he was elected president, he brought in a bunch of conservatives who believe in very limited government and who believe that elections should be conducted wholly on the local level. Now, that's interesting because President Reagan, 2 years later, signed an extension to the Voting Rights Act, 25 years, and George W. Bush signed that extension to the Voting Rights Act. But as you know, in 2013, the Supreme Court, led by conservative John Roberts, gutted portions of that Voting Rights Act, and we've been trying to get that back since then, particularly through the John Lewis Voting Advancement Act. That is the reason why we're in this conundrum now. If we had a Voting Rights Act, and if the Supreme Court had not gutted portions of that act, particularly Section 5, we wouldn't be in this mess right now.
Well, now let's bring on the congressman from New York, Jamaal Bowman, the Democratic congressman. Good morning, Congressman.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
Good to have you. We first question, I just laid it on the table, Congressman, and not to throw you immediately in the hot seat, but 1965, civil rights, lynching was still pretty much legal in America. Black men were called all types of boy, and black people were called all types of names without any repercussions. But you still got civil rights and voting rights passed. What's the difference in 2022? Why can't we get this passed?
You're talking about 1965. I was born in 76, and I remember being a young adult, 20 years old, and somebody calling me nigger. So, this is stuff that we are still living with today, which is why we can't get it done in 2022, or why we are struggling so much to get it done in 2022. We have to really be honest about who we are as a country, and we have to really be honest about our history and take a hard look in the mirror and acknowledge the ugly that has gone on and the ugly that continues to go on because we haven't acknowledged our history. And right now we have a Democratic majority in the House, in the Senate, and we have the White House. There's absolutely no reason why we in the House passed the John Lewis Voting Rights Act in August and the For the People Act in March, and we're just dealing with this in January, while Republicans in legislatures across the country are passing bills left and right, hundreds of bills to suppress the vote. And as we know, it's the black and brown vote, because when we vote, they lose. So unfortunately, right now, we have two Democrats who are standing in the way because they don't want to get rid of another Jim Crow relic that allowed lynching and other pieces of discrimination to continue to go on, which is the filibuster. So it's unacceptable, it's deplorable, and it's not realizing the moment after January 6th, which just had an insurrection attack our Capitol.
And Congressman, we also have with us the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law Voting Rights Project co-director Marcia Johnson Blanco. Want to bring her into the discussion as well. Marcia, you've heard what the congressman has said, and I know that you and your organization are working really hard to push this issue. Your thoughts?
So I think when we go back to 1965 and we look at why the Voting Rights Act was passed when it was after the country was shamed looking at state troopers beating civil rights activists on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So we always get this movement in legislation, I think, when the country is shamed into action. And that's what we really need to do right now. We are at a really inflection point in our democracy. As you've said, we have been working on fighting back against these suppressive laws that have been passed. States like Georgia, Texas, Florida looked at the historic turnout in 2020, and rather than applaud it and ensure that the opportunities that allowed people to access the ballots continued, they are directly going after how people voted, and particularly people of color voted. And so we as a country have to look at where we currently are, the pushback against voting rights, attempts now, legislatures are also passing, states are also passing laws that would allow state legislators to override the will of the people in upcoming elections. And, we have as a country now have to step up and say, this is not what a democracy looks like. The voice of the people need to be protected. And just as the country looked in 1965 and said, no, this is not the democracy we want to be, this is another one of those moments.
Yeah, and before we unleash the journalists that we have waiting to talk to you guys, let me just ask you this, Congressman. You mentioned that there are two Democrats who are holding things up. Obviously, you have 50 Republicans in the Senate who are also holding things up. But let's be clear about something here. What we've been able to see the previous 4 years under that administration, certainly under the leadership of Mitch McConnell in the Senate, when they wanted something done, as unpopular as it may have been, they got it done. They got everybody on board. What's holding up the Democrats, the leadership of getting those two senators, and let's call them out. We know who they are, Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Christian Sinema of Arizona. What's holding the Democrats back from getting it done?
Well, Mitch McConnell and the Republican Party don't care about democracy. They did it before Trump, and Trump just put the battery in their back even further. I mean, Mitch McConnell blocked President Obama's nomination to the Supreme Court at a time where something like that was unprecedented, and then confirmed 3 Supreme Court justices by changing the rules and by only needing a simple majority to do so. And we use only a simple majority to raise the debt ceiling, but we do not challenge the Senate rules for civil rights legislation and legislation that is going to move things forward for Black people and for the country. And yes, it's Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema who are pushing back the hardest in going around these rules. So this is an inflection point. And what we need, we need to see where things are by the time we get to Monday. And if things haven't moved where they need to go by Monday, we need for the country to ascend on Washington on Monday. But we also need a sustained civil rights movement, another civil rights movement in our country for the next decade, because we should not be coming back to this. It should not have been gutted in the first place, but it was. And now we're here. So now we got to deal with it, but then work together over the course of a decade, in my opinion, or longer, to sustain democracy for Black folk in this country.
Well, let's bring the journalists in. Lauren Burke of the Burke Wire. Also, we have Barrington Salmon. And also joining us is the president and CEO of the National Newspaper Publicists Association, Dr. Benjamin Chavis. Lauren, first of all, let's get Lauren's take. Lauren, I know you probably had some questions for the congressman and or for Marcia Johnson Blanco. So I'm going to throw it over to you, Lauren.
Yeah, I wondered, and shout out to Congressman Bowman. I was born in the Bronx, lived at 820 Boynton Avenue for a few years before moving to Long Island. I want to know if you'd heard about the legislative vehicle attempt that may happen today with regard to a bill called the NASA Enhanced Use Leasing Act, which is going to be used apparently as a vehicle for the voting rights legislation to try to pass it that way. I wondered if you'd heard about that, Congressman. I think that it's safe to say that Manchin is not going to support a change to the filibuster. So I have a feeling that there's going to be another maneuver and that might be it. And I wondered if you'd heard anything about that.
Yes, I have heard about that. That is happening. I believe that's what we are voting on today here in Congress. We voted on the rule last night. Today, we are voting on that NASA sort of framework to allow it to go to the Senate, which will allow for debate, which is the first step to this. Allow for debate, allow for conversation. Doesn't allow for Republicans to filibuster it, but you still need the 60-vote threshold to stop the debate. So I'm concerned about that piece of it. But at the end of the debate, it is a simple up and down vote. So there's still a couple of hurdles associated with that, but that is a pathway that we are taking now. But people are still in the Senate, I'm talking to senators every day, trying to just lobby Manchin and Sinema consistently, so they just get on board with going around the rules for a simple up and down vote, so a simple majority can pass this. So the Senate Majority Leader is trying a few different avenues to get this done, and it's crazy that we have to jump through all these hoops.
Yeah, and Barrington Salmon, again, let the journalists do their thing. Barrington, I know you had some questions as well. We have Barrington. Okay.
Good morning, Mr. Congressman.
There you go.
There he is. Hello, sir.
How are you? I'm wondering, why is it that every 25 years the Voting Rights Act has to be renewed? Why has there ever been an effort to make it permanent?
Not to my knowledge, no. There hasn't. I thought, and maybe many of you thought as well, that the 1965 Voting Rights Act was permanent. But what I've learned since then, and 25 years, go to your point, or recently to your point, is that if we don't work consistently to maintain the victories that we have had in the past, people are going to try to gut those victories and change those victories and bring us back to a situation where we don't have civil, human, or equal rights. So there are people working tirelessly every day to strip us of our rights and liberties and put us in a position where we continue to be a second-class group of people under an oppressive class and a power structure. So democracy is a contact sport, and it's something that we have to work at each and every day collaboratively as a people, or things will continue to be gutted and not allow us to gain the power that we really need to wield here in Congress. And that's part of my learning since I've been here as a freshman congressperson this year.
And I want to speak to some of that as well. I mean, the Voting Rights Act has a mix of permanent and temporary provisions. So, for example, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination nationwide, that's a permanent provision. Unfortunately, last year, the Supreme Court passed a decision that weakens that provision. And then we had provisions like Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which requires states with a history of discrimination in voting to get federal approval of voting changes. And that's a temporary, well, that provision was subject to a formula that needed to be updated over time. And that's what the reauthorizations were doing, was updating that formula, determining which states had to submit their changes for federal approval. And that's what we're pushing for in the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, is to restore that formula. And so states like Georgia and Florida that are passing these suppressive laws would have to submit it for federal approval before they could be implemented.
Congressman, we saw a couple of days ago, of course, the president and the vice president give powerful speeches on voting rights. We also, and he invoked Dr. Martin Luther King as well. But we've seen this push now. Today, the president is scheduled to meet with lawmakers to talk more about the filibuster and to talk about voting rights. And also the Congressional Black Caucus yesterday had a press conference about voting rights. And Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says that he will bring a vote by Monday on voting rights and the filibuster. We're seeing this great push. Where is this all leading over the next couple of days? Because it seems like it's going to culminate into something.
My hope is it leads to the passing of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the passing of the Freedom to Vote Act. That's my hope, that by Monday it leads to both of those things. What I also hope it leads to is a movement across this country. We have so many amazing organizations and people doing powerful, tremendous work. We have to come together and remain together in a coalition to apply consistent pressure on those in the Senate and in the House who do not want to pass legislation that will help us evolve into the multiracial democracy where we have equality and power across the board. You know, we're talking about voting rights today, but the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is another piece of legislation that passed the House, died in the Senate without ceremony, and we haven't talked about in several months. But that's another piece of legislation that can't move forward because of the Jim Crow relic of the filibuster. And there are many others, as we know. So we're hoping that it culminates in the passing of both bills by Monday. But if it doesn't, and even if it does, quite frankly, this is movement time. And the way we rose up for George Floyd in the summer of 2020, we got to rise up again to build sustained power. Because one last point I want to make, what I see wielded here in Washington since I've been here, and again, I just got here last year, is special interests and lobbies with a lot of money and resources wielding sustained power and controlling how Congress functions. We have to wield that same power as Black people and as people of color.
Yeah, Lauren Burke, one of our viewers, one of our loyal viewers, David Youngblood, writes that the Supreme Court is currently constructed to undo as much civil rights law as possible. Is that a concern, even if they were to pass voting rights law? You know, the Republicans will challenge somehow. Is that a concern?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, right now, you know, we see the Supreme Court, you know, kind of leaning more towards legislating than interpreting the Constitution, and having a 6-3 conservative majority is a concern. But again, like, how did we get here? Like, how did we get to a place where the Supreme Court was even to have this sort of conservative majority? Obviously, Trump winning the presidency is part of that, but also how Mitch McConnell has wielded power in the Senate over many years. So, we got to play hardball. Like we got to get down and dirty in the dirt and play hardball with the Republican Party, because if we don't, we're going to continue to be victims of what's happening at the Supreme Court. Also, look at what's happening with the Supreme Court with women's reproductive rights. They're considering overturning Roe v. Wade and what's happening at the state level due to that as well. So, yeah, man, a lot of work to do. Is a big concern at the Supreme Court level for sure.
Now I can throw it to Lauren Burke.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the lesson of the Supreme Court is that when you steal seats, which is, of course, technically, or maybe not technically, what Mitch McConnell has done with 3 Supreme Court picks, and really just using the rules and using his power to the fullest extent. We're not really seeing that on the Democratic side yet. And we're going to find out, I think, in 5 days. It looks like they might have to work through the weekend, whether or not the Democratic Party is going to use the full extent of their power when they control all 3 branches, although that not by much, for voting rights. I mean, this is what it comes down to. Part of the reason everything happened in 1965, that happened in 1965, is the strong leadership of Lyndon B. Johnson. And we need to see something like that on that level with Joe Biden. And yes, it does have to be more speeches and visiting memorials and all that. We'll see what happens. Obviously, the Republican Party is very focused because they understand that this moment is about power. It's about control. It's about who controls the future in this country with regard to decision making. They see that the country is obviously getting more diverse and blacker and browner, and they're trying to stop that from happening and stop that level of control from those constituencies. It's obvious, and the Democrats have to wake up to that.
Barrington?
Mr. Congressman, I'm wondering if there are serious conversations among you and your colleagues about fighting this battle in an asymmetrical fashion, because it seems like the Republicans spend all their time being as ruthless as they need to be, and Democrats are trying to play by the rules.
So yes, absolutely. We just have 2 Democrats who aren't fully on board with us as well, which is stopping things from moving forward to the way they need to be. So yes, those conversations are happening, as well as conversations that go beyond the scope of the legislation and the filibuster rules, if you will. Whether that involves occupying the Senate floor, whether that involves occupying the steps of Congress. One of the differences between 65 and now, and the 60s overall, obviously, is there were multiple movements in the 60s. The civil rights movements, the anti-war movement, the Black Power movement, all of those movements, contributed to the uprisings that were happening across the country. And the president was hearing from civil rights leaders on a day-to-day basis who demanded the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act pass. We need the same thing right now for this legislation and many others. There's not a movement happening across the country right now at the level of what happened in the 60s. I know we have COVID and there's reasons for that, but that is what's needed to continue to apply pressure. We need inside and outside pressure and people in the streets, and we're not there yet, but I know we're going to get there real soon.
Well, let's bring on our president and CEO, Dr. Benjamin Chavis, to get his thoughts on this. Dr. Chavis, how are you?
Well, good morning, everyone. And I am so especially honored on behalf of the Black Press of America to see Congressman Jamaal Bowman. Man, what you said is music to my ears about having a continuous, relentless, ongoing civil rights movement. But the reason why we got 1965 Voting Rights Act, I think Lauren is right about President Johnson, but what happened? It was Salmon. People were in the streets. People around the world saw the brutality that Black people were facing just to get the right to vote. And so the Voting Rights Act was passed, it wasn't narrowly passed. It was passed forcefully. And I think that Congressman is right. We need an ongoing movement. But let me say something about movement. Movement doesn't start in Washington, D.C. Movement starts at the precinct level. Movement starts at the grassroots level. Movement starts at the congressional district level. It starts statewide. We need to be marching, not just in Washington. We need to be marching on every state capital. We need to be marching on every county commission, every voting rights, every secretary of state. We need to put heat at the bottom so the heat will rise to the top. In West Virginia, there's not enough heat on Manchin. In Arizona, there's not enough heat on Sinema. So we need a pressure that's unrelenting. And my view is, Congressman Bowman, even after we win, we can't relent. I think that's been a mistake of the movement. We win a victory, but then we have to protect that victory by continuing the movement. C.T. Vivian said this about movement. He defined movement as people moving. We don't have people moving around voting rights all over the country like we should. There have been some, Sister Abrams and Latasha Brown have been doing in Georgia, yes, but we need that in every state. And it's just not Georgia and Florida. Over 40 states have introduced some type of voter of suppression. So, and keep in mind, the last thing I'll say, the demographics have changed. This is not 1965. The browning of America has taken place. We should be even more powerful in 2022 than we were in 1965. Where's our strength? Where's our power? It's at the street. It's at the community level. It's at the grassroots level. So I appeal to my fellow civil rights leaders. We need to huddle, not only to put pressure on those in the Congress, we need to huddle to arise, to raise the consciousness and the activation of our people. Power has always been in our hand, but it has to be activated.
Well, Rosalind Osgood, one of our viewers this morning, says people are not engaged. Many don't understand the power of community. I guess that goes along with what you're saying, Dr. Chavis. And David Youngblood says movement starts at school board meetings when they don't want your story told. Elizabeth Jackson says movement is people moving. That's right. And, civil rights, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, they're continuing to work, as Marcia Johnson Blanco has told us this morning. Marcia, what is the next step for you guys in this fight that that Democrats and much of America is taking up, and which is voting rights?
Yeah, so we use 3 tools. Advocacy right now, we're aggressively pushing for the passage of the federal legislation, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. And as was noted, these laws are going to be challenged. So we're going to be in the courts protecting the constitutionality of these legislation. But we also, through the Election Protection Program, provide assistance to voters who can call our 866-R Vote hotline and get the help they need. This is an election year and a transformative year in terms of what the Congress is going to look like. Moving forward. So we do a lot of voter education, make sure people know how to vote, what they need to vote, and get the help they need while voting. And we should also talk about, this is a year where we're doing a lot of redistricting. So maps are being changed, and we're challenging the maps that were drawn in Texas and in Georgia right now, because that's another way the right to vote is being undermined, with state legislatures drawing maps to take away the opportunity for minority voters to elect their candidates of choice. So there's a lot happening this year in which we need to engage. And I agree that we need to collectively raise our voices, because we know that in Washington, action happens when they hear from the people, and they're not hearing enough from us. So that's another thing we're going to be pushing, is to make sure the people speak out and make sure that their voices are heard. And we're going to do our part as well in the courts and on the ground.
Well, it's great to have you with us this morning. It's great to have the congressman, the authentic congressman from New York, Jamaal. Don't get no more authentic New York than Jamaal. Yeah, I'm a New Yorker.
Can I say one more thing before we go?
Absolutely.
So, I come from the education space. Before running for office, I was in education for 20 years as a teacher, counselor, and middle school principal. So I began sort of an education movements around the pushback of the overuse of standardized testing on our kids, particularly our Black and brown kids, and not unlocking their creativity. We beat a 31-year incumbent who was part of the power structure because of movement building. We were able to triple voter turnout amongst young people and amongst communities of color. And that's how we were able to win the election. That's why I'm the first Black person sitting in this seat in U.S. history. So I'm here because of movement. And the word Dr. Chavis used, huddle, that's the perfect word. We need to huddle in our living rooms, huddle in our community centers, huddle on every street corner across the country to put the pressure we need from the outside and in every crevice of the country so that the lawyers can do their work on the inside and so I can do my work on the inside from a congressional level. So we need everyone to get engaged, stay engaged, and remain engaged to build the country that we want. This is our country. We built it with our bare hands. We got to rebuild it in a way that fits our image so that we can wield power that benefits us and humanity, because that's what people forget. It's not just about us. We want to change the world for humanity because humanity has gone wrong because of European settler colonialism for hundreds of years. So we got work to do, and it starts with the huddling that we do.
Well, Congressman, before you run, I'm going to go around the table with our journalists. Everybody, 30 seconds, your last question for the Congressman. And we'll start with James Wright.
You're on
mute. Unmute.
I'm sorry, I don't have a question for the Congressman, but I will make a quick point. If you can get the John Lewis bill and the Freedom to Vote bill, that gives a great deal of enthusiasm for the Washington, D.C. Admission Act of 2021 to get on the Senate floor.
Yeah, absolutely, James. And Barrington Salmon?
I hope that the Democratic Party finally finds a backbone. I wish there were 535 of you, Congressman Bowman, because these establishment people, I think that you have a whole lot more people in the Senate who don't want to pass the Voting Rights Act besides Manchin and Sinema, and they're giving them cover. So I just hope that you guys smoke them out and you give them hell.
Well, Lauren Burke.
Congressman, I just wanted to know if you'd heard anything about working through the weekend. I'm sure you probably don't know all the details yet, but I just wanted you to comment on that if you could.
I know there are senators pushing for that, and I hope Schumer does it. But absolutely, I've spoken to at least 2 senators that are pushing to have that happen. Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you. And finally, our president and CEO, Dr. Chavis, any last thoughts for the Congressman?
I'm optimistic. I'm enthusiastic. And listen, I can see Jamaal Bowman later on, a decade from now, being the president of the United States. I think your words, your journey to the Congress from the grassroots up is emblematic of what we need to replicate all over the country. We need a fighting spirit, we need a fighting activation, and you can count on the Black press who can be right there raising awareness. And I know a word that we don't use much since the days of Frederick Douglass. We need to agitate for social change. We need to wake some people up. We need to get people back into the streets. And once we return to the streets, we need to stay in the streets unrelentingly.
Well, thank you again, Democratic Congressman Jamaal Bowman of New York, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, Voting Rights Project, co-director Marcia Johnson Blanco, Capitol Hill journalist extraordinaire, Lauren Burke from the Burke Wire, NNPA correspondent Barrington Salmon, and Let It Be Known correspondent and Washington Informer reporter James Wright. Thank you so much. You guys, if you don't mind, hang out a little bit in the green room so we can wrap this up. But for our viewers, we will see you tomorrow. Hey, thanks again, guys. Really appreciate it. Greer, I know you